right, again, good evening. All right. Well, on behalf of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, welcome to Pugh Hall and to the University of Florida. I have the great honor in a few minutes of introducing Dr. William H. Chafe, one of the preeminent historians of our time. It's just a tremendous privilege and a real blessing to be able to host Dr. Chafe at the University of Florida. My name is Paul ORTIZ. I'm the director of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program. On behalf of our program, our student, staff, faculty, and community, welcome. We're just thrilled you could be here with us this evening. You know, after a very productive 5-year run of successful public programs, I had promised our staff and students a sabbatical this year. And as my dear colleague David Colburn, director of the Bob Graham Center, realizes, it takes a lot of energy and passion to organize a public program. But in this case, the opportunity to hear Bill Chafe speak was something that excited our students and staff and has really energized this community. So we're happy to take at least a day off from our sabbatical, if you can do that, if such a thing is possible. Before I introduce Professor Chafe, I would like to draw your attention to another event that the Proctor program has been working on. Between February 13th and the 22nd, the UF School of Theater and Dance will stage a new play titled Gator Tales. Gator Tales is based on oral history interviews conducted by students and staff at the Proctor program with African American elders, talking about their experiences in this university over the past half-century. The play is based on 14 riveting oral narratives, firsthand accounts of the struggle to democratize and to humanize this university. And if you want to understand how the University of Florida made the transition from an all-white institution into a real research university open to all, this is where you should really start. These are powerful narratives, and you're going to recognize the name of many of the narrators in Gator Tales. People like Evelyn Moore Mickle, Ron Coleman, Sam Taylor, and Joelle Buchanan, who we just lost just last year. You'll laugh, you'll cry, you'll be angry, you'll be overjoyed. And please do not miss this play. We have information, we have postcards in the back from Theater Arts. You can purchase tickets from the University box office or Ticketmaster for the play. The title of William Chafe's lecture this evening is "The More Things Change, the More They Remain the Same, Race in America." I'm proud to say I've known Bill for over 2 decades. He was my dissertation advisor at Duke University. He was my mentor, my friend, my colleague, my go-to person, the person whenever I need help or advice. Bill is always there for me. He's always there for all of his students. He's a remarkable human being. I could list his achievements for hours and hours and hours. He has served as Dean of the Arts and Sciences at Duke. He's been president of the Organization of American Historians. In the early 1970s, along with fellow Duke professor Lawrence Goodwin, Dr. Chafe started the Duke Oral History Program. And out of the interviews conducted by this program, Bill wrote a groundbreaking book which completely changed the way we thought about the study of the Civil Rights Movement. And the title of that book, and I know many of you have read it, Civilities and Civil Rights, Greensboro, North Carolina, and the Black Struggle for Freedom. It received the inaugural, the first annual Robert F. Kennedy Center for Justice and Human Rights Book Award given in 1981. This was the first of many groundbreaking books in areas including women's history, social movement studies, African American history, as well as the history of the presidency. I know many of you have read a certain book about Hillary and Bill Clinton that Dr. Chafe also authored. In all of these fields, William Chafe has excelled, and his writing has changed the way we think about history in general. However, Professor Chafe doesn't just write history, he makes it. His work as an administrator, dissertation chair, and departmental chair at Duke, his leadership in the history profession in general, in making higher education more accessible to students of color and to first-generation college students like myself is legendary and admired all throughout the country. And I just want to thank you, Bill, now that I have you on the front stage here, for opening up, for again, democratizing higher education for so many of us. And we have much to learn from Dr. Chafe at the University of Florida from the example of his career and his practice. Likewise, Bill doesn't just write about social movements, he participates in them. So in 2013, and this was a photograph that our students and staff from the Proctor program chose. Many of you have seen this, the front piece for the program, the poster, where Bill was among 30 protesters who were arrested for civil disobedience at the Moral Monday protests at North Carolina General Assembly as a means of calling attention to the legislative assault in the state's history by the governor and the state legislature. And Bill, you'll be glad to know that we've recently emulated you and have started our own Moral Mondays here in the state of Florida. Now, there are many stories one can tell about one's former dissertation advisor. I can tell you the first time I met this man was as a graduate student, walking into his house every, I think, Monday morning. Bill taught a graduate social movement seminar at Duke University. And literally the first time I saw him, he was wearing a kitchen apron. And he was preparing food for his graduate students. And to see him walk out of the kitchen with an apron and with a tray of food was really exciting. Because here you had someone who didn't just talk about women's history, didn't just talk about the history of social change, but modeled those types of behaviors. He made it clear to us from the very beginning that he wanted us to work hard, to read a lot, take notice of current grad students, but also he made it clear to us that he was there to serve us, literally. And he wanted us to challenge stereotypes, stereotypes about race, stereotypes about gender, stereotypes about sex. But in challenging him intellectually, he wanted to also model the best behavior. So this evening, our program is co-sponsored by two wonderful organizations, both of which I have the great honor of being affiliated with. One is the UF Department of History. I know many of my history colleagues are here this evening, as well as the Milbauer Program in Southern History. So we're very grateful for their support. The program tonight will be, Bill is going to talk to us for a while. And as you can see in the background, we have a wonderful reception which is being organized even as I speak. Great food. We have wraps. We have baked goods. Sheila, as many of you know, is leading that baking endeavor. So we encourage you to stay after the formal event and to fellowship with us, to have great food, drink, and we're going to have a great time. So essentially the program will be Bill will speak, and then we'll do a Q&A for a little while, and then we'll break and get something to nibble on and continue the discussion about social change. So please, friends and colleagues, join me in welcoming William H. Chafe to the University of Florida.
Wow. There are times when one thinks one's at one's own wake. Thank you so much, Paul and Sheila, for all the work you're doing, and I appreciate it so much. One of the things that's most wonderful about someone who's been able to be in this profession for as long as I have, the best thing about it is one's students. One's students are the lifeblood of the entire activity, and you learn so much from them. And then they go out and they do such incredibly important things. And Paul has just been an amazing presence here at the University of Florida. He has done so much to make the Proctor Oral History Program one of the leaders in the entire country. I know you're all aware of the dynamism that takes place here every day and of the students that he has inspired. And I think that there's nothing that's more a tribute to one's career than to have incredible people like Paul as graduates and as friends and as colleagues, as mentors. So I've taken on a huge topic today. This is about all of American history, and I think I'm going to try to do it in 35 to 40 minutes, and that's kind of stupid to start with, but you might as well know that I realize it's stupid. The other thing is I've had a terrible cold, and if I start to cough, please forgive me. That's why the water's there. You know, our country boasts so much about the Declaration of Independence and all people being created equal. and having an inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Unfortunately, one of the most consistent and persistent characteristics of our country is not equality of opportunity, but inequality. And inequality has been a major presence in our lives and remains so very much today. Inequality is based on many, many things, but certainly it's been based upon race. It's also based upon class, which we don't talk very much about. And it's based upon gender. I'm going to focus today primarily on the issues of race and of the intersection of class and race. Slavery became institutionalized in the United States in the mid-17th century. And it became institutionalized in many respects as a way of demarcating a whole group of people who were of a different color from people of different classes who were white. One of the things that the creators of slavery, legally, were able to do was to say what we share in common by virtue of our skin color is that we're not them. From that point forward, we have an ongoing struggle characterized by slave rebellions, by resistance from African Americans on plantations, by creating their own communities behind the veil after dark and after sunset, where people talked among themselves, created their own institutions, their own churches, their own way of trying to relate to each other and fight back. I'm not sure how many of you have seen Selma or 12 Years a Slave. Those are very effective ways of conveying the degree to which those experiences were horrific. I think that one of the most important things I'd gleaned from the Selma movie was that it was the most powerful expression that I've seen since I was involved in the movement back then of the terror that existed on a day-by-day basis, the terror of putting one's life on the line potentially and being involved in that kind of struggle. So this is a story of a struggle which has a huge, huge, long history. And finally came to the point where even though some of the drafters of the Declaration of Independence actually wanted to eliminate slavery, were not able to do so because of the political pressures that they experienced and some of their own political preferences. And so we had this extraordinary period after the country's birth of trying to deal with this central theme of American history and the way in which it was such a total opposite from the democracy the Declaration of Independence talked about. And ultimately that had to result in the most horrible war we could imagine. And I'm not sure that we actually come to grips with the power of the Civil War. It is a situation in which you're talking about incredible casualties. You're talking about 613,000 people being killed. You're talking about 10% of that group being black, fighting for their own freedom. We're talking about suffering of an unparalleled nature. And when that war was finally over, we had the opportunity to create a new world. It's not clear where that's going to go, and Abraham Lincoln's not there to be part of it. But with Reconstruction, you have the creation of biracial governments throughout the old Confederacy. And those biracial governments actually are the first governments to engage in legislation that's going to provide for the social welfare, for education, for public schools, for even some facilities for the mentally ill. They are democratic, small d. They are effective. Yes, they are criticized by subsequent eras of historians who don't really understand the dynamics of what was taking place as being corrupt, but in fact they were far less corrupt than the governments that preceded them. And yet they were always a threat because they counteracted the white racism that had prevailed throughout the entire South and the rest of the country during the period before the Civil War. And it became clear that the only way in which those governments could be able to continue and some form of equality achieved was if the federal government were willing to stand behind its commitment to equal rights. Irony of ironies, that came to an end in 1876. The federal government had come in to the South in 1871 to suppress the powerful rebellion of the Ku Klux Klan, but they got tired of doing that. And irony of ironies, it was the Republican Party, the party that liberated the slaves, which basically ended Reconstruction. And Rutherford B. Hayes made the agreement with the Democratic Party, not with the Democratic Party, but with the states of Louisiana and Florida and South Carolina, to cast their electoral votes for him rather than Samuel Tilden, in return for which the Republican Party would withdraw federal troops from the South and end Reconstruction. Now, all the rights that had been gained during Reconstruction were not ended. The right to vote continued, although it was basically not to be used to in any way threaten established political power within the South. But it was essentially a situation in which there was a return to the kind of conservative, racist, and plantation owner-run government style that had prevailed before the Civil War. There were challenges to this. There were challenges that were very powerful. There was the Readjuster movement in Virginia, which was very successful for a period of time. There was the Farmers' Alliances, the White Farmers Alliance and the Colored Farmers Alliance. They were not part of the same operation, but they met at the same time, and they interacted with each other. They each had well over 1 million members. And that eventually resulted in the populist revolt of the 1880s and 1890s. A revolt that actually was extremely successful in mobilizing people who wanted to come together, black and white, to change the structure, to depose the power of the new ruling bureaucracy, the Bourbon Democrats, and to encourage federal programs that would support agriculture and sharecroppers and tenant farmers. The Populist Party was a party that was trying to address issues of class and race, and bringing whites and blacks together to try to work in hand and challenge the power of that elite. It was an interesting experience, but quickly the power elite, the white power elite, responded. They had the Mississippi Plan, which basically disenfranchised all black people, but ultimately all white people, and most white people as well, by using literacy tests, by using the grandfather clause, by using poll taxes. And you had basically the resurgence of that white power structure against the legacy of Reconstruction in the 1890s. North Carolina, my own state, was a fascinating example of that. In North Carolina, the fusion movement, a combination of blacks and Republicans and Democrats, Republicans rather, the fusion movement won an election across the state in 1894 and again in 1896. For the first time in many years, there were a representative number of blacks holding public office. A black congressman was elected in eastern North Carolina. Progress was being made in terms of the economy. And at that point in time, and this is really the most important point to clarify, at that point in time, it was the best white people of North Carolina, the best white people, those who we now say, oh, they would never engage in racist bigotry or be inflammatory, etc. The best white people were the ones who planted the seed of insurrection on the part of whites against blacks. The editor of the Raleigh News and Observer, one of our leading newspapers, the head of the Democratic Party, someone who became ultimately the governor of the state, Charles Aycock. All these people started to publicize information claiming that black men were out to rape white women. And the only way to protect our white women was to rise up in revolt against this insidious challenge to the white community. The idea was that you would find a way of uniting rich white people with poor white people to turn against and scapegoat black people. And so you have the Wilmington Race Riot of 1898, in which the editor of the News and Observer said, we want to find a way to fill the Cape Fear River with black bodies. Interesting. People who we've been taught to believe never would think about doing that kind of thing or using that kind of rhetoric. And the Wilmington Race Riot was pivotal, pivotal. It basically destroyed the fusion movement and biracial democracy in North Carolina. And it resulted in the election of a new legislature in 1898 and 1900 that essentially followed the path of Mississippi and other states and institutionalized Jim Crow. Now, all during this period, we have Plessy v. Ferguson, too. But blacks in North Carolina actually thought they could overcome Plessy v. Ferguson, because that was 1896, 2 years before the Wilmington Race Riot. They thought they could overcome it because they had confidence enough in their biracial coalition. But in the end, nothing could overcome the ability of the quote-unquote best white people to mobilize against race, against black people. Now, for too long, I think the assumption has been that after Jim Crow was institutionalized by 1901, that after that, there was almost no resistance. I think we have a kind of stereotyped perception of the period from 1901 through the Civil Rights Movement as being a period of total white domination and total black suppression and victimization. Paul was very much involved in a huge oral history project we did at Duke, in which we interviewed 1,350 African Americans who lived in 11 different states and 22 different communities during the age of segregation. And one of the things we found was that there was a whole lot more resistance than anyone ever talked about. It wasn't necessarily overt, frontal, confrontational, but it was using all the tools you had at your command to try to advance the interests of the black community. It might involve creating black community institutions. It might involve defending black teachers if principals spoke out against them or tried to punish them. It might involve tricking white people into going along with certain things that were to the advantage of black people. But all along, throughout this period, and you know about all the bus boycotts and trolley boycotts that took place here in Florida, elsewhere, in the early 1900s. This is not something in which only happens in the 1950s. This happens all the way through. You have the formation of the NAACP in 1909. The determination of W.B. Du Bois and others, including Booker T. Washington, who is generally seen as being the opposite of Du Bois, but who actually funded most of the litigation against the suppression of voting rights and for the issues of civil rights. So basically, all during this period, you have people fighting back. Once again, war comes in. And World War I is one of those moments where, once again, black people take a chance on America. W.B. Du Bois writes a lead editorial in the Crisis magazine, the magazine of the NAACP, in which he says we should support President Wilson and the war to make the world safe for democracy. We should support our government in its war against Germany. Because if we do, we will end up benefiting from that because we believe that democracy can triumph here as well as abroad. Alas, Du Bois came to regret those words. Because even though black soldiers fought in the 1 year, more than 1 year, but not too long that war in Europe, when the war ended, repression set back in vicious terms. Race riots throughout the country, which whites were suppressing blacks. The Red Scare, the whole approach in which anyone who was seeking that kind of change was suspected of being a traitor. And so we go back to resistance during the 1920s. You have the great migration of blacks out of the South toward the North and the West. And eventually we have the beginning, for the first time since Reconstruction, of somewhat more friendly federal government. Franklin Roosevelt never did all the things he could have done for civil rights. In fact, very few of the things he could have done for civil rights. Eleanor Roosevelt was a very different person. She believed strongly in equality. And Eleanor Roosevelt and the New Deal had a quote-unquote black cabinet of group of black officials who worked to make things better in terms of health care, in terms of social welfare, in terms of support for people who were on relief and poor. But it was never, ever what could have been done. But it was a beginning, a tiny beginning. And that tiny beginning became the basis for a new assault, a new mobilization on the part of black Americans to try to establish their rights. And so we have the first March on Washington movement. We associate the March on Washington with 1963. The first March on Washington movement was organized by A. Philip Randolph, the president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters Union. Yes, thank you. And it was an extraordinary mobilization in which white people were not going to be part. Randolph was threatening to bring 50,000 black people to Washington to march on the Capitol unless the president signed an executive order for fair employment practices. FDR wanted nothing to do with it. And yet, Eleanor Roosevelt persuaded him that he really needed to meet with A. Philip Randolph and other black leaders. And he finally did. And at a time when Roosevelt was desperate to mobilize as much support as he could for the upcoming war against Nazism, he signed that executive order. That was the beginning of a period that was incredibly important. World War II was pretty amazing in terms of what it did for the entire country. It was the first and only time in the 20th century when there's any redistribution of income from the top toward the bottom. The top 5% lost income, the bottom 20% gained income during that period. It was a time of full employment after 25% unemployment rate during the Depression. It was a time when 6.5 million women went to work for the first time, an increase of 57% in the female labor force. Only this time they weren't young single women, they were married women over 40. 75% of them were married women. And they were of all races. Blacks responded to World War II as they had to World War I, and volunteered and were drafted in numbers exceeding their portion of the population. It was a time of incredible activism. Segregation was rampant. Oppression was incredible in the South. One of the stories that was blacks were not allowed to go into town. They were not allowed to participate in recreational activities with whites. And one of the amazing stories of that time is when a group of blacks at a Southern basic training camp went into town to go to dinner and saw in the restaurant, which they could not enter, a group of German prisoners of war having dinner, sitting down, but they couldn't go in. So this was a period of time that was full of oppression and victimization and violence and horror, but it was also a time when there was a huge amount more activism. The black press became very committed to the notion of a double V campaign, victory at home as well as victory abroad. Victory at home meant democracy at home as well as democracy abroad. That double V campaign was enormously successful. It basically resulted in a huge increase in activism. The NAACP, which at that point was the leading, but almost the only civil rights organization in the country, not only, but was the leading one, went in membership from 50,000 in 1940 to 500,000 in 1945. Just think about that, 50,000 to 500,000. That's an incredible increase. That suggests the degree to which the war was galvanizing the community. In addition, one of the most fascinating things that happened was that once black soldiers left the South, went to California, went to Hawaii, went to England, eventually went to France, they found a very different environment, very different atmosphere. They were treated as honorable, distinguished people who should be entertained, who should be thanked for their work. And they luxuriated in that experience because it was so counter to what they had experienced all the time in their own country. And they were determined that that experience would be one they would bring back with them. Also during this time, you have this incredible migration of blacks out of the South, 2 million people. And you have a huge increase because of the FEPC order that A. Philip Randolph had required the president to sign, of an increase in good jobs, in jobs that blacks had never before been able to handle, to apply for. In the past, blacks could be janitors, they could be housekeepers, but they could not be secretaries, they could not be workers in a factory. Now they could be, at least more than ever before. And so when the war ends, and those black soldiers come back home, they don't come back home to go back into the same situation they were in before. Medgar Evers comes back to Jackson, Mississippi, and goes to register to vote. Amzie Moore does the same thing. You have this incredible determination that we are going to achieve and demand the rights that we fought to preserve. This time, there is continued white repression, race riots across the country. But there is now, unlike the end of World War I, a determination to persist, not to give up, to grow in activism. And that activism results in a much more concerted effort to make sure that change happens. The NAACP is at the head of it, but it's not just the NAACP. It's the National Negro Congress. It's the labor unions of some, especially the UAW and others. And they are working hard to make sure that progress is made. And they demand that Truman do something, the new president. Truman is someone whose rhetoric is fine, but whose action always falls well short of the rhetoric. But he does create the Truman Civil Rights Commission with people like Frank Porter Graham on it. And that Civil Rights Commission comes up with a report which is pretty amazing in terms of the demands it makes and endorses. Desegregation of the armed forces, voting rights. It doesn't talk about desegregation throughout the country, but it does talk about very pivotal issues. And Truman actually endorses it. He does try to contain a strong civil rights platform for the Democratic Party in 1948, but he's overruled by the Democratic Party led by Hubert Humphrey, who was at that point mayor of Minneapolis. So rhetorically, for the first time, you have a political party which is supporting civil rights advances formally, legislatively, executively. Unfortunately, Truman does not follow through on much of that. He does not have a majority in Congress, at least a majority for things like voting rights. All congressional committees are basically run by Southerners, chaired by Southerners. But change is in the air. Things are happening. And the NAACP takes it upon itself to essentially go at the heart of the issue of segregation. The Plessy v. Ferguson case creates a kind of cage within which the NAACP is forced to combat discrimination. The cage says separate but equal is constitutional. Therefore, what the NAACP has to do is essentially say, no, separate is not equal, and prove that in a whole variety of cases, you cannot create a law school in Missouri for one black student with very few books and very few teachers and say that's equal to the University of Missouri Law School with all white students and all those white libraries. It goes on beyond that in the late 40s to say that not only is the physical facility required to be equal, but you have to have conditions that support equality. So in Oklahoma, you are not allowed to admit a black student to a previously all-white law school and separate him off from all the students in the classroom and have him eat separately and have him not use the same library facilities, taking into account other aspects of equality besides simply the physical plant. And now the NAACP has to make a huge decision. Will it challenge the very foundation of that law and ask the Supreme Court to overrule Brown v. Ferguson, overrule Plessy v. Ferguson? And with the help and advice of people like John Hope Franklin, my former colleague who is one of the great historians of American history, Thurgood Marshall decided to do that, to challenge the entire idea of Plessy v. Ferguson. At that point, something pivotal happens, and it does show that the way in which individuals can make a difference in history. Chief Justice Vinson dies. Vinson was basically against the Brown decision, would have been against it. It would have been a 6-3 decision. Earl Warren comes onto the court, deeply remorseful over his role in creating the Japanese internment camps, Japanese-American internment camps during World War II, wanting to stand up for some other form of justice. And Warren simply does a brilliant job lobbying the two members of the court who are negative votes on Brown. And he succeeds by sheer persistence and by being incredibly effective in the case he makes. And so we get the 9-0 decision by the Supreme Court in 1954. But Eisenhower doesn't follow through. Eisenhower never endorses the Brown decision. Eisenhower never says, the Supreme Court has ruled, I stand with the Supreme Court, this is now the law of the land, within 2 years we will have total desegregation of our schools. He never does that. Yes, he goes into Little Rock in 57, but that's largely because his subordinate, Governor Faubus, using a military model, has essentially revolted against him, and he has to suppress that revolt. But he never, ever, ever, except in Washington, D.C., where he does enforce integration, he never, ever stands up for it. Now, the civil rights movement, as we know it, has already been in progress for a long, long time. We generally think of Rosa Parks as simply a dignified, respected, well-respected woman who's worked hard all day in Montgomery and simply decides not to get up and give her seat to a white person on the bus in Montgomery. And that's the kind of for those who have a portrayal of the civil rights movement as the master narrative, it begins in 55 with Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott, and it ends in 68 when Dr. King is assassinated. What we now know from our good friends and scholars is that Rosa Parks had been one of the most incredible activists in civil rights issues for well over a decade before 1955. She had mobilized a group of black women to insist that a group of policemen be put on trial for raping a black woman in southern Alabama. She is the secretary of the NAACP in Montgomery. She has been to the most activist kind of conference center where they train people to be involved in civil rights. She is someone who is totally primed to do this, and it's no accident that she does it and how she does it, and it's no accident that the first person she calls afterwards is E.D. Nixon, who's the head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters Union in Montgomery. And it's no accident that the next person she calls is Joanne Robinson, who's head of the Women's Political Council, an all-black group parallel to the League of Women Voters in Montgomery. And it's no accident that that very night, Joanne Robinson and the Women's Political Council print 40,000 leaflets at Alabama State College talking about the bus boycott. This is not a sort of Immaculate Conception movement. This is a movement that is ready to go. And Rosa Parks lights the spark that makes it go. For 381 days, that boycott goes on. And eventually the Supreme Court rules that segregated buses are unconstitutional. Now after that, things slow down a little bit. There's not as much activism. There's not as much demand. The boycott, incredibly successful as it was essentially an act of not challenging. It was not riding the buses, not going right after segregation in a direct way. And that's the context out of which we have the beginnings of the sit-in movement. Greensboro, North Carolina. You have 4 college freshmen going to North Carolina A&T, black college. 3 of them have grown up in Greensboro. They've gone to a high school where their teachers have taught them the importance of standing up for their own rights, where their chemistry teacher has had them address voter registration envelopes in his homeroom, where their English teacher has told them, you can be the best person you are possibly, you have the potential to be. And they've been to a black church where the minister is a strong advocate of civil rights and was very involved in civil rights in Shaw University. And they go to an NAACP youth group started by a woman named Ella Baker in 1943, not 60, 1943, when Ella Baker was the main organizer for the NAACP throughout the South, traveling 20,000 miles a year organizing local chapters of the NAACP. So those students who come of age during the Brown decision, they're just becoming intellectually and politically aware at that point in time, now have a sense that this is now, it's their fight. What can they do about it? And they talk all semester long in the fall about how to challenge this. And one of them has an ugly experience in Richmond, Virginia, coming back from New York, where he is badly mistreated in a Richmond bus terminal. And that episode creates the desire to confront segregation directly. They talk about it and talk about it and talk about it, and they finally decide there's a simple way of doing this. We will go to where we go all the time to buy our school supplies, to buy our bathroom supplies, and we will challenge segregation by going to the lunch counter and demand to be served. They're scared to death. They don't know what's going to happen. They go to their parents and tell them that we're not sure we're going to be able to do this, but we want you to know we're going to do it. And that February 1st, 1960, they go into the Woolworths. They get their notebooks, keep the receipts. They get their toothpaste, keep the receipts. And they go to the lunch counter and sit down and ask for a cup of coffee. And they're told, we don't serve colored people here. They open the school books, and they sit there for 2 hours until the store closes. Go back to campus, and word spreads about what they've done. The next day, there are 23, not 4, who go to Woolworths all day long. The day after that, there were 66. The day after that, there were 100. And on the 5th day, there were 1,000 people in downtown Greensboro. When a group of whites challenges them, says, who do you think you guys are? The black students say, we the Union Army. We're the Union Army. Within 8 weeks, exactly similar demonstrations break out in 54 cities in 9 different states. It's been the spark that lights everything up. Everything. And in April of 1960, Ella Baker, acting executive secretary of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, convenes a meeting at Shaw University of all those students who want to come, who've been part of this movement. And they create the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which becomes, from that point forward, the cutting edge of the civil rights struggle, helping to organize Mississippi, Alabama, Southwest Georgia. People like Bob Moses, John Lewis, carrying forward the struggle, creating Freedom Summer where Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman are murdered, but which galvanizes the entire population around the issue of doing something to change things. So it's a very interesting time. And the students are now in the head, in the leadership of this whole thing. And finally, by 1963, the struggle has reached the point where John F. Kennedy can no longer be quiet. We often think of Kennedy as being for civil rights all along. Rhetorically, that was partly true. He did call Coretta Scott King in 1960, when her husband was taken to jail, to express his concern. But he didn't do anything beyond that. Now in 1963, he decides that it's important to do something. And against the advice of all of his cabinet, he asks for time on national TV and says to the American people, we are facing primarily a moral problem as old as the scriptures. Who among us would choose to be born a Negro, given the infant mortality rate, the unemployment rate, the dropout rate? Who among us would do that? It is time, he said, for us to act. And he proposes the basis of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now, Kennedy, of course, does not live to see that come to passage. Lyndon Johnson is the one who presides over that. But it is the beginning of the legislative breakthrough, which follows the next year with, after the Selma and Montgomery March, which, if you've seen the movie, you can see why it's so important. Lyndon Johnson supports the Voting Rights Act. It's basically a very interesting time, and it creates a different environment. There are huge differences that happen right away. The number of blacks voting in the South now goes from 5% to 65 to 70%. New opportunities open up because of the legislative prohibition of economic discrimination in the 1964 Civil Rights Act. The number of black college students increases by 500% between 1964 and 1974. There is a new opening of decent jobs in corporations, in the professions, and law schools. And there is desegregation of the American suburbs, in which at least some black people are able to move into affluent neighborhoods that were previously all white. And you have the situation in which, by the end of the 1970s, it looks as though we've made a major breakthrough. Ronald Reagan basically says, the problem's gone. We've taken care of it. There's no longer any segregation. And, I'm happy to have a Martin Luther King holiday because, after all, he said that the issue is really the content of your character, not the color of your skin. And Reagan essentially sanitized Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement and acted as though we'd taken care of all of our problems. Well, that very period of time was also the time when we started moving away from income equality. In 1977, the top 1% of the population, in terms of income, earned 9%, 1 to 9. 1% earned 9% of the national income. Every year since then, that figure has changed. And today, the top 1% earns 33%. 33% of the national income. 9% to 33% in basically a period of 35 years. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, following Ronald Reagan, says we no longer have racism in America. And so he writes a decision that invalidates the Voting Rights Act. Shortly thereafter, a whole bunch of states start imposing restrictions on voting rights, including North Carolina. North Carolina is a brilliant example of where we are going politically, where we have gone in the last 6 years, 5 years. North Carolina legislature, Republican legislature elected in the non-presidential election of 2010, has the authority to redistrict based on the 2010 census. And they redistrict so it's basically a classic example of gerrymandering, supporting the existing party in power. So in 2014, Democrats win 49.5% of the vote in North Carolina. They win 1/3 of the seats in the legislature because that gerrymandering has taken place. The new legislature, refuses to allow 500,000 North Carolinians to go on Medicaid, even though the total bill is going to be paid by the federal government for the next 3 years and most of it after that as well. 500,000 people not getting medical care. They eliminate taxes on people making over $1 million a year and increase taxes on people making $30,000 a year. They eliminate funds for preschool and early childhood education. And they put in place a series of voting restrictions, including a voter ID, which requires that you have a photograph of a government photograph in order to be able to go to vote. 600,000 blacks and Latinos in North Carolina do not have driver's licenses. What does that mean in terms of the future? All this has been happening. All of this is part of the underlying struggle that continues, the resurgence of Jim Crow, the desire basically to put back in place what existed after 1901 and what existed after 1877. We are all very aware of how the Ferguson, Michael Brown story and the Eric Garner story have helped to crystallize a sensibility about what's happening. What we don't necessarily realize is the fact that the infrastructure of what's happening is so much stronger than just those episodes. Those episodes are horrific, but they simply reflect the surface manifestation of something that's been going on and will continue to go on until it is put to a halt. So we remain in a situation in our country where inequality, largely based on race and the intersection of race with class, but also the way in which that intersects with gender, have created a circumstance in which we are more unequal today than we've been at any time since the 1920s. And we are not making any progress to address that because there is such resistance to it, and the politics of today is so divisive and hard to deal with. So the more things change, the more they remain the same. We have seen some great struggles and some extraordinary achievements. But we have also seen the incredible power of those in power to stay in power and to deny the right to equal voting and equal participation by a very large portion of the population. So it's not a time to celebrate. It's a time to be concerned, a time to get active. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill, for that wonderful talk. We have some questions our staff are circulating. We discovered this is a way to get to more questions more quickly.
Great.
And we'll do this for about the next 10 minutes or so, and then I see Tamara Jenkins in the back, and then we'll move to our reception with food and drink. Bill, if you don't mind, I'll read the questions for you.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so the first question.
I can't read very well.
Right.
I can read. I can't read my handwriting. I can read yours.
Okay, very good, very good. Well, okay, so Dr. Chafe, so the first question we have here is, would you agree that The Birth of a Nation, 1915, we're in the 100th anniversary of that film, D.W. Griffith's film, played a major role in pushing the NAACP, the Urban League, filmmaker Oscar Michaud, Du Bois, Monroe Trotter, and the Harlem Renaissance to blossom? What impact did the film make?
Well, it was such a popular film and became such an iconic film that I think it did generate a whole series of responses on a cultural level that were very powerful. So I think that the answer is yes, that it did have that kind of very significant impact. And the Harlem Renaissance is one of the great positive stories that comes out of the 1920s and early 1930s. As is the Garvey movement.
What role does the drastic rise in the prison population in recent history play in current social justice movements?
Huge. I mean, there are as many African Americans incarcerated as there are in college. The cost of that is well over $45,000 per year per person. And we have a situation in which so much of our budget is now going to prison maintenance that we have almost no opportunity to use any of that money for more important social causes, such as food, such as education, such as early childhood stuff. So I think that it's time, and then time for someone to try to address this at a national level and to start the dialogue. I think that my own sense, at least, is that in the last 2 months, Obama has been more liberated than he's been for the 6 years to say some things. And I think that he needs to talk about this issue as well as the issue of inequality. He needs to talk, and he has been talking about early childhood education. And we're talking about a situation in which the first 3 years of life are so pivotal to what one can eventually imagine oneself doing. And yet we're doing nothing right now to help to make that a better world.
Okay, This question looks like it's coming from a teacher. What do you think is the purpose of primary and secondary schools teaching such a whitewashed, class-washed, and male-washed version of American history? What can future educators, especially at one high school or middle school, do to challenge this hegemony without getting fired?
Well, that's a terrific question. Just as an aside, but a powerful aside, the Wilmington Race Riot, which I talked about, and which was such a decisive event in North Carolina history, is not mentioned in the textbook about North Carolina that was used in the schools and colleges throughout North Carolina until 3 years ago. It was not mentioned, not even acknowledged as an event. So obviously we have such a sanitized version of what's been going on. We don't get any sense of the struggle from below, of the activism of people in the neighborhoods, and it's just it's something which teachers can break through, but to break through it requires A, independence, B, courage, and C, support from one's peers, and the ability to say to the principal or the school superintendent, the truth is the truth.
You've used that word sanitized a couple times. Don't you think it's a conspiracy of silence with just complicity with the status quo?
Yeah, I think that I generally don't like the word conspiracy, but I think that you're right. I mean, there's a desire to look away, not to acknowledge, not to confront the existential reality that is part of our daily lives. And I think that that's true of it's true of climate change, it's true of gender relations, it's true of everything we're talking about in terms of race. And the bottom line is that, if you, only the top 50% in terms of education and background and capacity to take advantage of the civil rights, only that 50% was able to take advantage of it. The other 50%, there's no change in their lives for the last 50 years, no change. And we need to find a way of addressing that.
Okay, Bill, this is a North Carolina question in part. How would you liken Obama's victory in North Carolina in 2008 to Harvey Gantt's defeat against Jesse Helms in 1990?
Well, I think that the organizing potential and activity of the Democrats in 2008 was fantastic, and some of our colleagues were very involved with that at Duke. There was a very effective grassroots organization. I mean, Tim Tyson and Gunther Peck were involved with that. Harvey Gantt, situation was, I think, Jesse Helms.
Yeah.
I've seen Jesse Helms recently in a documentary talk about how much he cares about all the people of North Carolina and how difficult it was for him to go against Frank Porter Graham. Well, that's BS. I mean, you know, when Jesse Helms attacked Frank Porter Graham in 1950 and helped to support a photograph of Frank Porter Graham dancing with a black woman with a black face imposed on the photograph, you know, Jesse Helms is Jesse Helms.
Bill, is it realistic and honest to believe that the necessary change that you're talking about will take place without massive civil disobedience?
That's a really tough question. I'm not sure we can get massive civil disobedience organized at this point, primarily because the issues are so structural and institutional. I mean, the racism that exists today is, yes, if it's Ferguson or if it's Staten Island, you can mobilize people. But the basic problems are infuse the entire social and economic structure. And it's hard to organize around those kinds of issues. The Occupy movement was one effort to try to begin to do that. But, you know, you don't have the symbolism of a Woolworth's lunch counter or a segregated theater with the buzzard's roost in the balcony and the denial of opportunity to stay in a decent hotel. So it's harder to do that. I think what's really important is instead, I think, voting mobilization. And there we've got a huge problem. And I think we don't really address that problem very much. The basic problem is that there's not really a chance to do anything about this till 2020, because that's the next census. B, even if you are able to create a different kind of pattern of drawing legislative districts, the first election that's going to be true of is 2022, and it's not at all guaranteed that that's going to be possible. So I think we're talking about a situation which demographically, you know, in 2010, for the first time, a majority of the children born in America were non-white. In 2050, a majority of the population will be non-white. But can we wait that long? And if the voting rights are taken away from those people, how are they going to exercise that privilege, that right? Not privilege, right. So I think we've got a really serious political issue which requires a major commitment to organizing on a sustained long-term basis in which people understand from the beginning that it's not going to get cured overnight. It's not, Birmingham demonstrations are not going to cure this. It's going to be something much, much more systemic and long-term and requiring incredible discipline.
So we have 3 more questions, and then we'll break for the reception. So today would have been Trayvon Martin's 20th birthday. How can students and academics like yourself and ourselves recreate the activism of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee or ignite our own version of it?
I think there we have to start with local issues, organize around those issues, mobilize not just college students, but the entire community to exert pressure on those issues. And then maybe build alliances. Don't forget that, I mean, SNCC was an organization that was locally based, organized on grassroots activism, did not have the kind of top-down structure that SCLC had with Dr. King. It was much more a place that in Greenwood, Mississippi, Macomb, various Delta communities, you had local people doing the hard work. I think that that's what's going to happen here, and then they begin to have coalitions that will work together and become active. But I don't think it's possible to, at this moment in time, do any kind of top-down kind of organizing.
All right, this is a good one to culminate on. Of all the racially charged social problems today, prison industrial complex, police brutality, excessive force, racial profiling, immigration, voting rights, income, wealth inequality, etc. Which do you believe we should focus on most earnestly and strongly at this time, and why? Sounds like an interview question.
Well, I would basically say income inequality because it brings into play all issues of race, ethnicity, and gender and class. I think if you actually get into that issue in depth, you have a basis for addressing a bunch of the other questions. I mean, the immigration question is obviously the one that right now is most explosive. But I think that in the end, that plays into the inequality question. And I think that if you begin to, and it seems to me that just the degree to which your former governor has himself started talking about inequality in the poor suggests that he understands that this is a powerful issue, and that maybe we can make this a much greater focal point for activity.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and we can continue the discussions, but we want to be cognizant Bill is recovering from a serious cold. We're just very grateful for his presentation. Let's go ahead and thank him, and we'll break for the reception.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. It was wonderful.
Thank you very much. You're a great audience. Thank you.
Ooh.